I just.
No, they put it out.
No, there's only one at 3, but it doesn't show you on there, but we
You
don't
don't mind? Yeah, if you want to.
This one's a really good
You can pretend to be me.
She initially just said the last two, so I don't want to overburden you. But
Oh,
you
yeah.
can be on it if you want.
Tell us.
Well, you know how pushy she is.
That's
I know.
so
So
fun.
Yes, we are.
It's disgraceful. Orange is in everywhere.
That's why you need the fourth finger and you're really proud.
Well, the Cookie Monster here, but I think it's hysterical. It looks just like. You can look at it. I mean, I did not believe you. I was like. Geologists did find a Cookie Monster. It looks just like. I mean, what are the odds of what's going on with the character? Oh, that's a geo. There are apparently a lot of geos that people think look like Cookie Monsters. Oh, that's true. Oh, yeah, but that's, it's by far. So that's our panel today. This is what you need to be around.
Well, great, thank you. It's there.
Sorry, I didn't.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Vegas always good. But
I'll
really,
grab
I don't know immediately what I'm going to
There's some
say.
seats over here too.
Maybe go back in a few
Oh,
minutes.
it's not like vote for Cheshire Monster Geo. Right.
Yes.
I tell you, when I looked at it, it was hard.
There's also some seats.
Katanji, Justice Katanji. Yes, that's right. Hey.
All right. We all ready? Welcome everyone to this first panel on remixing and genre. My name is Dr. Eric Stanley. I'm a professor of anthropology. So welcome to this panel. We have a number of guests with us today. We have Walter John Williams, our guest of honor this year. We also have Emily Mott. We have Reese Hogan. We got Jeffrey Kennedy and Connie Willis, our late addition to the panel. So we're going to start off by having you just kind of go down the line and introduce yourself. Then we'll have a chance for you to talk about remixing and genre kind of broadly. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Feel free to introduce yourself. And as we get going, this is kind of an informal thing. So if you all want to like crosstalk or engage each other without having been prompted by the audience members, feel free to. Whichever end you'd like to start.
Okay, well, I'm Walter John Williams, and I have a kind of personal connection to the beginning of science fiction because a lot of critics see Frankenstein as the first real science fiction novel by Mary Shelley. And I, as it happens, I wrote a alternative history story about Mary Shelley. And because she was an alternative Mary Shelley, who meant an alternative Byron, and an alternative Percy Bysshe Shelley, and a whole lot of alternative people, in fact, we came up with an alternate paradigm for science fiction by the end of that story. Oh, and the story was called Wall, Stone, Crab, which is available in my best of.
I don't know, I thought you were going to pass the bar. I'm Reese Hogan. I write primarily science fiction. I came out with my last novel in 2019 from Angry Robot. It's called Shrouded Loyalties, and it's a diesel punk military sci-fi, sort of with spy killer. I have another novel before that, Holding the Ashes, which is post-apocalyptic with death gods. I also work for the Writing Mastery Academy website, which is run by Jessica Brody, who wrote the Cat Writes Novel. So I write blog, right?
I'm Emily Ma. I always wanted to be a science fiction and fantasy author. I kind of lost on my way by self-publishing a few romance novels that took off, and that took over my life for a good decade. So I've always written genre, just not. Well, everything I've written pretty much is genre, except for there's a one YA that I guess people might try to sort of cram into the literary category. But I love genre. I love the tropes that you learn in genre. I love the toolbox that comes with genre. So I love genre. I'm also the interim editorial director of SIPWA, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association.
I was gonna say association too, we could say that.
Oh,
now.
yeah, we changed our name because we keep changing it to update.
I'm Jackie Kennedy, current president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. We used to be of America, and we have just.
It used to be the Science Fiction Writers of America, which represented science fiction.
Which makes me de facto ruler.
It is not, nowhere specifically says only this world.
That's a good point. That is true. So when I am not hurting several kittens, I write books. I write fantasy romance, pretty much epic fantasy with centered female characters and kissing. And I think I'm at like 56 books now, 56 published titles, multiple different series. And I'm a hybrid author. I write for both traditional publishing and most recently St. Martin's. And I also have a robust self-publishing career, which pays my mortgage.
And she has the first job in the world, having to be science fiction and fantasy writers association is it's an awful job.
Well, you've been there.
No,
you never.
no, I was always smart enough not to.
I need to learn from you.
Jack was president, and it is the most thankless and awful job.
You know, but that's not true. People show their appreciation
That is
all the
true.
time.
That is
because
true.
People really are wonderful.
That is true. It's just that you have to deal with science fiction writers and fantasy writers who are all hopelessly neurotic
And the trolls.
and the trolls, but they're everywhere. So, yeah, I'm Connie Willis. I've been writing science fiction for a long time. I would say I identify myself as a science fiction writer, but occasionally move over into things like telepathy and near-death experiences, which are more than fantasy thing. But always in genre somewhere. And the edges are very blurry in our genre on all sides. So it's and point of the piano, exactly.
That was well done.
Yeah, good segue. Our first question. So this is open to everyone. I'm kind of curious about, where you see yourself situated, kind of in the discipline or in the field. What genres we've already talked about a little bit, but kind of how strictly you find yourself adhering to kind of those borders, or do you find yourself kind of crossing them or remixing them as the panel talks about? So we can kind of talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I guess I can talk about how I see the breakdown between literary and genre. That works as a place to start. Literary tends to be more out of the academic tradition. People who go to get their degrees, do their MFAs, and often will be like writers in residence at universities and things like that. Genre are just for people who just want to make a buck. And so you get this very different view on how to put a book together. The literary tradition tends to be a lot more, artsy, I guess you would say, whereas genre is just like, here's how you plot, here's how you pace, here's what this means, here's what that means. And that's what I love about genre, and that's why a lot of genre writers do multiple genres, because even though the look and feel of the pieces are very different, a lot of the underlying substructure is very similar.
I think you could argue that, and I will argue,
Yes.
that literary works are their own genre. that is
Right.
simply a genre with its very specific expectations, which is the definition of a genre, that you know what kind of story you're going to get. And just because it doesn't have the same tropes as other genres do, it does have its own tropes.
Yeah, it's just colloquially, when people say genre, often people sort of curl in their lip, they're talking.
They're not talking about
The
them, they're talking about us.
Well, one of the things with the literary genre, as we understand it now, was created by the CIA. And I'm not joking, this is real, you can look it up. That subsequent to the Second World War, we ended up in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union sent out their ballet troupes and their orchestras and their operas. And were blasting the West with culture. And the CIA felt that we were losing the culture war. We needed to get some culture to fight back against this hideous Soviet onslaught. So they put money into literature. And they created the Paris Review, which is one of the major literary magazines now. It was made with CIA money. So was the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is the most prestigious writers workshop. And they promoted a certain kind of fiction. And the problem was that a lot of the best politics. And so you couldn't promote their work and say, our leftists are better than your leftists. It just, wouldn't have worked for CIA purposes. So what they wanted was a type of literature that had no politics at all. And that's what they got. And that was the dominant form of literary fiction until at least the 90s. And there were some exceptions. That if you happen to be from South America or Latin America, you can write magical realism. And that broke the walls down a little bit. But what is really breaking the walls down now is genre, it's science fiction. It's, we are storming the bastions of academia, and which is no longer protected by CIA money.
Can I have some of it?
I'm the person in Sepwa who is always adding the and fantasy, because there is a tendency to say science fiction as that is the encompassing umbrella, and I feel like science fiction and fantasy tend to be different ranges.
Well, I think, and from the very beginning, we had the magazine of fantasy and science fiction for a reason. And that reason was that where do you put Shirley Jackson? Where do you put the lottery? What is that? Is that a science fiction story? There is no outer space. There is no future. There are no robots. It's a simple story about a nice little town in America. And where do you put that? And where do you put Philip K. Dick, who is, yes, he has robots, he has androids, and he has spaceships and he has things, but he's really playing these mind-bending games with you to make you challenge the idea of what is reality and can we possibly know what reality is, and am I really reading this story? Which really I don't think of as traditional science fiction. The borders have always been extremely blurry, and there's always the awful panic where it's, is it fantasy or is it science fiction? It's like,
And McCaffrey.
And McCaffrey.
no one cares.
Alien
No one-
planets,
Right.
dragons.
Right. No one cares. The people writing it do not care. And the people reading it mostly don't care. I guess there are a few people out there who are like, I only read science fiction. I would never ever read fantasy or vice versa. But most of the people, they just want interesting stories. And so the blurry edges, which used to include literary fiction, like E.M. Forster, half of E.M. Forster's short stories. He wrote, Howard's End and Room with a View, but he also wrote a number of short stories that are clearly, they appear in fantasy collections, they appear in science fiction collections. He wrote the most famous Stuck in a Room with a Computer story ever called The Machine Stops in 1889. So, he just, the edges were always very blurry. Dickens did fantasy type stuff. He had somebody spontaneously combust in one of his stories.
In Britain, that is not fantasy. Very much believed.
Never mind. Never mind the spontaneous combustion.
And she like the literary aspects is like questioning things about life and about the world around us. And that's a lot of what you see in some of those ones you were mentioning. So that's where you see some of the literary questions inside how to start putting it together. And it comes a lot into how that book was pitched and marketed. And that's how blurry the lines can be. Who's gonna buy it and how are they gonna sell it?
That's really what drives it, is because people want to know where to put it on the shelf.
Yeah. But you know, Charlotte, for example, is a very techy society before, but the technology is being able to kind of teleport, except, right?
It goes through an alternate route.
Exactly, you go somewhere
Yeah.
else as you're teleporting,
And
and
that's like
and
a
there's
sci-fi with gods.
some
in it.
fantasy-ish, kind of stuff in there.
I've
So, yeah.
always mixed genres because it's, that's why we're fantasy sci-fi writers, because we can do whatever we want.
Because how would you classify it?
I call it diesel punk sci-fi. Yeah, but like the last book I wrote, the one I just sent out to ladies yesterday, is like late 1800s gothic necromancer, like with ghosts and with horror, and I don't know what genre that is. People are like, is that sci-fi? Is that fantasy? I'm like, it's gothic. I don't know what you call it. I don't care. I think it's fun.
One of the things that I realize is that whatever your first success is, you're that thing forever. Okay.
That's why they're never the same story twice. Stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And a good example of that is David Mitchell, the author of Cloud Atlas. And his first big success was a literary novel. And his latest one is about two groups of warring magicians who've been around for thousands of years. And they have a huge battle climax in a maze constructed in an old castle in England, and they're hurling magical bolts at each other. And it's still literary fiction because his first success was literary fiction. And they can't conceive of him in any other way. Likewise, my first success was Hardwired, which was a science fiction novel. So now I'm defined as a science fiction novelist, and whatever I write will be viewed as science fiction, no matter what it is.
Well, there's always the stories of something that got to basically the wrong editorial desk, and they thought it was new and fresh and amazing.
Yeah.
And it was actually just a different genre. I mean, I would put Outlander in that category, for example.
Yeah.
And no shade to Diana Gabaldon at all, but it landed on a literary.
Yeah.
And they almost didn't get published. It was, a story of the editor said, "I will quit if you don't publish." This is and it's sort of a glib version of the story, not what specifically happened. They said, "Oh, this is a great romance novel." And she's like, "Well, I'm a fantasy writer." So a bestseller in fantasy is 50,000. A bestseller in romance is 500,000. She said, "Okay, I'm a romance writer."
I think part of the problem is that publishers and writers and readers are on opposite sides of a dilemma. The publishers want a guaranteed bestseller. And to get that, what was popular last year? Okay, this was popular last year, Bridges of Madison County. So we're going to do Bridges of Portales. Even though I don't think you have any bridges in Portales. And bridges of whatever. And to them, all they can think of is to do the same thing over and over again. That's how you get a guaranteed bestseller. I do not like Bridges of Madison County, but it was different from everything else that came out that year. And that was one reason I think it was very successful. It was a romance. People who were romance writers knew that it wasn't a very good romance, but if you've never read a romance before, you probably thought it was pretty good. And that so frequently happens in where you have never seen this genre before, and then you're introduced to it. Because the truth is, what readers want and what writers want to do is do whatever they want and tell interesting stories. And what readers want to do is to read interesting things that they may or may not have known that they liked before they picked it up, and they want to read different stuff all the time. And so these two things are in direct opposition all the time, and you fight that all the time.
And something that will happen are we just running away with
You're
the topic?
doing great.
Okay.
You're gonna be a lot of trouble.
Okay. One thing that happens when you're a newbie writer and you're like querying agents and querying editors and so forth, like one of the first pieces of advice that they'll give you is like, know what genre you're writing. Don't waste my time by not knowing what genre you're writing. But when you are writing a story, you don't know what genre you're writing. And a lot of times I didn't know what genre I was writing until the publisher actually published it and put on their fantasy romance. And I was like, I didn't know fantasy romance was a genre. Okay.
That's a good point. I originally Shrouded Loyalties as like fantasy. I forget what I called it, but it wasn't evil punk. That was kind of their word for it. So yeah, that changed later, and it's another example of like this kind of thing people want. My novel that's on sub right now was pitched to somebody that doesn't do much sci-fi. So they and the editor fell in love with it and wanted to buy it, was trying to pitch it as a thriller with sci-fi elements. Sadly, didn't quite pull it off, so it didn't quite get picked up. But they'll try to pitch things in different ways for their intended buyer, basically.
Well, and for every don't waste my time synopsis by an agent, I remember, whenever you're subbing, you research the agent to see what they like, and often they'll put up the best pitch letter they ever received, and it's often weird what worked for them. And one of them was like, don't waste my time with fantasy or whatever, except this person was so novel and interesting. They're making, it's not a fantasy world. And the main character, they're superpowered. It's like, who's ever heard of this? It's like every fantasy reader ever. It's a mainstay of fantasy, but the person with no magic. Yeah. So.
Right. And they, especially the literary critics who have never read anything, they will see Handmaid's Tale and go, oh my God, this is the most original thing in the world. I like Handmaid's Tale, but John Wyndham did it for Consider Her Ways back in 1955, and I'm sure that other science fiction and fantasy writers can tell you other stories that were exactly this theme, exactly this kind of situation.
Kazuo Ishiguro's
Oh,
Never
yes.
Let Me Go, and it's like,
Exactly.
oh, you wrote about clone.
Right.
How original.
Yeah, so you have to understand that the publisher may not be familiar at all with what you're doing, even though everyone else in the world is totally familiar with what you're doing.
And it can
Never
be
let me go, I think, even though it was about clowns, it was a totally unsuccessful genre novel.
Right.
And a very successful literary novel, so, he at least knew what he was doing.
Well, and he follows that rule of he's defined by his first novel.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and it's a joke in genres, like, because sometimes there's bigger money in the mainstream literary, whatever. It's like you try to get literary, so you get the less representative cover art, and the specific kind of marketing campaign. But you often don't change really what you've written, just how you pitch it.
Good. I have another question. I'd like to move on. One of the things that I think defines genre fiction are the tropes that either people adhere to, or they remix, or they reject. So kind of interested, what are your either favorite or your most hated tropes of your respective genres, wherever you'd like to locate themselves? And then how do you take these tropes, which are often stale or tired or something like that, and then bring them into the 21st century?
I would argue if it's become a trope, so the difference between a trend and a trope is how enduring it is. So, vampires, I think, have transitioned from trend to trope. It seems like we'll probably always have like a vampire or something or other television series. Like there's always a CSI type series. There's always a legal drama series. There's always a police procedural series. Those are tropes. And I think when people say tired old tropes, what they aren't understanding is if it made it to trope status, we're still grappling with it in some way. So we need to understand why it's still around and why it became a trope in order to be able to successfully make use of it.
Right, and a good example in science fiction is time travel, which has been around from the very beginning.
From the beginning of
And
time.
of H.G. Wells' Time Machine. And it was very interesting. First, it went through a phase after H.G. Wells of going places, going to the future, going to the past, looking at it. Okay. And then that they did as much as they could with that. And then in the 50s, they were doing a whole bunch of stuff, usually in the short form, short fiction, of games that you play with time. The time worm that eats its own tail, the story that begins and ends in the same spot, the loop that the person can't get out of, all these little tricks and games of science fiction time travel. And then that wore itself out, because everybody had kind of rung all the changes they could on that. When I started writing, when I wrote Firewatch and took it to writer's workshop that I was in, they said, you can't write a time travel story. It's dead. It died in the 50s. Every time That died in the 50s. The games died in the 50s. The sightseeing died in the 50s. This is different. This is new. I'm doing something new with this. And I did it, and then everybody else did it. I mean, the thousands of people. I won't take claims. They claim to have reinventing it, but a whole bunch of people started doing alternate histories and all kinds of different time travelers that were involved in changing the past or not changing the past and so on. And it's still developing, and it'll die out for a while because everybody's done everything they can think of with time travel. But time travel is never going to die. It's not ever going to die. It's too interesting. And then something will come along technologically that will give people a whole new way to play with the idea, or something will come along where, the fantasy romance writers will suddenly think of a new thing to do with it. And then there'll be this new blossoming of time travel. And it's just over and over again. Don't let anybody ever tell you that what you want to write about is dead just because a lot of people have written about it in the past and done a lot of different things. You just have to think what you want to do that's different.
Yeah, to branch off of that, I would say there's no such thing as a tired trope. There's just stories that haven't done it well.
Right.
And didn't grapple with it in an original way, which, that's our theme for the conference, right? You don't have the same story twice. Don't just do what somebody else did. What do you want to do with the trope? And it does move through different subgenres. Like one of my very favorite romance tropes is the marriage of convenience, the marriage of state. And that's one that's difficult to pull off in a contemporary romance setting because it's really hard. The writers, bless their hearts, they try. But like the thing where, and Emily, the former lawyer, will jump in here and say, that there's like, the story where, the person can't inherit the company or whatever unless they marry.
Not legally enforceable.
Sorry, contemporary romance authors. But if you do an alternate fantasy world, the ways that you can make people have to marry each other to, stop the war or save the kingdom or replace the magic or all these things, there's so many things you could do.
I think it's important to remember that tropes are tropes for a reason, and that's because people like them and they're popular, and there's nothing wrong with using tropes, and you should absolutely do it. So like they're saying, you want to do something, not something that's never been done before, but something that's never been done like this before. So find your own way to put your own slant on that trope that you want to do. What I often will do is I have to come up with like 3 radically different ideas and turn them into one novel. Because I find that when you pair stuff, you come up with these really interesting, unique plot lines. When you're trying to put a trope into a completely different setting than you'd ever look for it, you'll come up with pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, just as an example, I mean, one of my least favorite tropes in the world is the chosen one.
Yeah.
Oh God, he's the lost prince raised as a swineherd destined to, win the magic sword and the princess.
Luke Skywalker.
And then Harry Potter.
Right.
Right, and Harry Potter is the chosen one, but he's screwed. This brings him no joy at all. He's totally screwed, and he's screwed for like 6 increasingly long books.
He just gets more extensively screwed.
Well, as Joshy said, if you put something in a new setting, what Harry Potter, the brilliance of Harry Potter, is that they took the old Tom Brown School Days book, the story set in the British public school with all the trappings of British public schools, which people have always loved those novels. And then they put their magic fantasy into that new setting, which nobody had ever done before. It's all old elements, but mixed, like Reese was saying, stuck together in new and interesting ways.
Well, there's a snobbery that I think we always need to avoid as writers. It's like, that's a trope. And that almost derivative, meaning, it's too much like
my least favorite. I'm going to send up that trope.
I mean, whereas,
Good luck with it.
these books sell a lot of copies, and maybe you can argue that the grammar is not perfect, or that, the writer style is not to your liking or whatever. But it is nevertheless part of a grand conversation society is having about these larger issues. And to say that that's tired or sad or, formulaic or garbage is fairly common. Is to say that what captivates people and what gets them thinking is garbage, and that people are garbage. And that's what we always have to avoid. When, if something is popular, we have to have respect for the people making it popular.
And look for why it lights people up.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could take the most tired trope and put an interesting author on it, and they can make it good, even if they follow everything that's supposed to. It just depends who you're reading and what your style is, what you like to read.
Or going to a book club where they're reading a book you hate, that's incredibly popular. It's enlightening to hear what it is that people like.
There was a great essay written about Twilight at the beginning of the Twilight thing. Not the book, but
The thing, yes.
The thing, the Twilight thing. And I have real problems with Twilight. But the gist of the essay was adolescent girls have a deep and abiding need for romance in their lives. Not for love, not for sex, not for just a relationship, for the concept of romance in their lives. And I was like, yeah, that's what that is.
About being cherished in the very essence of yourself.
Right. And I think that if you really hate something, I hate the Da Vinci Code. Give me a red pen. But you're asking the wrong question. The right question is, why do people love this? What is it that they find so fascinating? And look past the terrible writing. Information dumps and all those things, and to find out what it is. I have not figured out what it is they like.
I think it's the making of something that people thought they knew, their own religion.
Right,
So
that's
and
true,
shocking,
that's true.
And that's my problem with the video, because it's like, how do you guys know this?
That's true. It's that, and it's also that there is, look, it's a new way to look at art.
Yeah.
Also, you know, you didn't see what was really there.
I think people love stuff like that, you know, discovering something.
Right.
Well, the artists were great mathematicians, or whatever.
What do you all see as the kind of frontiers of genre fiction in the 21st century? And in particular, what genres do you think are ripe for remixing?
I would argue that the frontiers are new media. So,
That's not the topic, it's the.
well, because
The medium,
because the science fiction fantasy started as a little ghetto in novels and short stories, and has kind of taken over Hollywood, because Hollywood, in order to get a story into 2 hours or less, requires a lot of technical skill. Well, the people who actually were gaining those technical skills are genre writers. This is how you plot, this is how you pace, this is its structure. And that, I would argue, is why genre has won the day so decisively in film and television. It's pretty much all genre. It's not just fantasy and science fiction, but it's mystery and suspense and horror and all of these things. Now, if you look at like dramatic podcasts, how do you evoke the genre elements of in a podcast? That's my take on it. What do you guys think?
Sounds good to me. Yeah, I mean, there are new ways to tell your story, and I'm sort of being paid to use the old ways. So that's so I'm not familiar with as many of these things. I mean, I've seen the podcast explosion. I've not.
Well, gaming. You're part of gaming.
Gaming's been around for a while, but yeah. But the alternate reality game that I wrote was a genuinely new experience, and it was so fun to do that. But unfortunately, that whole genre has died out because there was no way
it
to
just
make money.
became QAnon.
That's true.
That's true.
Yeah, they did read my text.
I would though, I think you're right, Emily, with all these new platforms and ways to tell stories, but I also think the old stuff still works, and the old stuff will always work. And whether you're watching a miniseries on Netflix, or something that's being streamed into your home, the binge watching, everybody's like, I don't understand binge watching. You're like, it's every cliffhanger book that's ever been written. Dickens used to do this. People gathered at the docks in New York City to find out if Little Nell had died in an old curiosity shop. They couldn't wait to find out what happens next. It's the same thing that made you watch all the episodes of Breaking Bad at once, or whatever you were watching. And the old stuff always works. The stuff that, whatever genre mixing we do, whatever new platforms we find, whatever different kinds of ways to tell stories, they still have all the same old elements. And Shakespeare, who I would argue was a genre writer at heart. He wrote crime novels, he wrote crime plays, he wrote fantasies, he did romances, he was good at all of it. But he absolutely believed in cliffhangers, in reversals, in heavily plotted stories, and characters that met each other through dialogue and sparring through dialogue and all these different things that are still around, and which is why you can still have modern movies made with old Shakespeare plots, and they all agree, and everybody loves it.
So I've got two things on this. One, as far as the new mediums for storytelling, that put my SIPWA hat on here. We just introduced for the first time in forever, brand new membership requirements where we decoupled the eligibility to become a full and associate member of SIPWA from word count. It is no longer predicated on prose. It is predicated on if you've made a certain amount of money from your catalog of work, then you can be a member. And we don't care if you did it in music or in images or
Self-publishing.
Self-publishing, or what, if you made the money, if you got paid for your work, then it counts. And part of that is to embrace the fact that people are using all kinds of different media to tell stories. And then as far as like mixing and stuff, something that I've seen personally is that, and there's still a contingent within sci-fi fantasy who will get very upset if there's like too much kissing in their science fiction and fantasy books. But I would say, no, I mean, I actually had someone tell me that I don't write fantasy because I write romance. And I said, well, actually romance is not antimatter. It doesn't cancel out. But one thing that's happened is I've had so many people come up to me saying it's so great to see someone who writes fantasy and romance crossover as president of the SIPWA, because it's like it legitimizes the romance cookies. And so I think that we are seeing a lot of that more openness to blending those elements in different stories, that it doesn't have to be only this thing, only this counts.
We have about 20 minutes left, so we're going to leave some time here for questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to ask.
No, I think
Oh.
you said a lot. No, I don't have anything to add.
Can I add one thing, and that what you were talking about, legitimizing romance? One of the, I guess, laws of human nature is that everybody loves to have somebody else to look down on.
Yes.
So science fiction, when I got into the field, was actually the bottom. But we very quickly found that we could look down on the fantasy writers who feel better about and they found that they could look down on the romance writers who feel better about themselves. And then below them was the comics. And then the comics turned into graphic novels and moved up here. And then all of us had problems. And so that's just a natural impulse that you want to, and the truth is, any way of telling a story is legitimate. Any platform is legitimate. Any version is legitimate. Any form, any subject matter is legitimate. It's all storytelling, and it's all good.
We can all get along.
Except for QAnon, possibly. Not
Well,
sure about that.
The only reason I bring that up is there was a really good article that I probably should have a citation for, but that talked about how hard it is when you're running an ARG, an alternate reality game, when the players catch on to something you did not put in the game. And they will become so wedded to it because they discovered it and it was really hard to find, and you have to quickly try to think of a way to people, so we do have this natural impulse. And so, yeah, that's.
Okay. You want to do questions?
Yeah, no, we can do questions.
So I've heard debates that science fiction, anything can go into science fiction really, it feels like that. But earlier in the panel, you kept saying the genre is science fiction and God. So do you all believe that there is no place for God in science fiction, or is it just typically when it's done, it's such a heavily fantasy-based God that they can't include it?
No, because I got started in Christian publishing and I'm a science fiction writer.
If you read The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, speaking of remixing genres, that is a total sci-fi first concept. And it's a bit Mormons.
Jesuits.
Jesuits going into space, making first contact. That was pitched as a sci-fi, except it was sold as a literary novel. There's definitely a place for God.
And Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and what's the Good Omens, and which is fantasy, but and Ray Bradbury's fire balloons and James Blish's case of conscience, and yeah, they've been dealing with religion forever.
And then C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, yeah. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
kind of Christian.
What are you talking?
C.S. Lewis.
Oh, C.S. Lewis. Duh. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, wasn't L. Ron Hubbard a sci-fi writer?
Yeah,
I don't know if
We don't talk about it.
We don't.
The same level as Keanu.
Well, I mean, the powerhouse of genre fiction writing, right up there with the NMU, just to say, is BYU. And it's just got so
Yes.
many
Yes.
genre writers
It
who
does.
graduated from it and who teach there. And
Right.
there is a slight religious bent to that university.
I think so.
Yeah, please, you talked about that you come up with 3 big ideas and then try to apply them. Can you talk more about that? Or is that maybe an example, or how you come up with those?
Okay, so I'll use Shredded Loyalty as an example. I knew I wanted to write a fantasy with a World War II type setting, because I hadn't seen that done as much. I knew I wanted to write a girl disguised as a guy, because I'm trans and I was exploring a lot of that at the time. And I knew I wanted to write a sibling relationship that really was really bad. So that so one of the siblings was seduced by the enemy while his sister was in the army. So those are kind of the 3 ideas I had, and I had to play around with them a lot before I found how they started to fit together. And one of those ideas came from a really old shelved novel, which I pulled pieces from. So that's kind of how it starts for me. I can't even write a book if I only have one idea. I have to come up with others, because otherwise it just comes out pretty plain. Even short stories, I need one to be good. So everything I've written, I can name like the 3 core ideas for where I started, including short stories. Does that answer enough of that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think comes up with really fun
Yeah,
stuff.
I think one of the most misleading questions people ask is, where did you get the idea for this book? Because it's not an idea, it's not a single idea, it's a bunch of ideas, and there's lots. It's not just story ideas or plot ideas or character ideas. It's also like setting ideas and dialogue ideas and just all kinds of junk that you just pluck from the air and decide to put in your book too.
I know my books, I got the idea because it was the answer to a Jeopardy question. It said doppelganger. It's not enough books about doppelganger.
Well, the 2 most common questions are, where do you get your ideas? And I have an idea, will you co-write it with me?
No.
Ideas are, everybody's got ideas. We're swimming in a world.
That's not the hard part.
Do you guys ever find yourselves like trying to move into a different genre, but then reincorporating everything that you've already written before? And if so, like, how do you guys try to stray away from that?
If we do.
If you do, yeah, if so, if you do.
So can you explain a little bit more about
Well,
what you're
Um,
struggling with?
yeah, so like, Mr. Williams, you said you used to do like historical writing,
yeah.
right? So, in what you do now in science fiction, do you ever find yourself kind of reiterating those tropes or
Oh, sure.
reiterating that process?
Yeah, a fair amount of my science fiction is set in the historical past. Wrote the Mary Shelley story, I wrote a Poe story.
Well, the way you do space opera is very like.
Right.
Yeah.
Privateers too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys like find it as like an issue, or do you guys find it as like rather strength within what you do?
Yeah, I think you're gonna find that part of what you're talking about here is voice and theme.
Mhm.
And I heard Walter touch on this, and Dorinda said something about it in the informal conversation, that we all tend to have our themes that in some ways we are telling the same story over and over again because we are playing with this question or set of questions that haunts us. And you can see it turn up in different ways in different stories, and you're kind of coming at it from different angles. And so, yeah, maybe you switch up the genre or you switch up the tropes, but you're still trying to, like Walter mentioned, power, which a lot of my stories have to do with power too, and it's like digging at how do you get power or what do you depth.
I find
I think if you find yourself confident at this one thing, that just reinforces, you know, that you're, it gives a depth to the new work that you wouldn't otherwise have seen.
I mean, Schindler's List, that whole sequence where the train gets diverted
Oh,
and they get herded off and their clothes taken away and their hair shorn and herded into the
I
showers.
think you're upsetting Connie.
that's the best part of that.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's just visceral and gripping and horrifying, and it is Steven Spielberg using his ability to create suspense like no other. He's using exactly the same tools he's used when it's, you know, supernatural or alien or, you know, whatever. And he was able to make that scene what it was because of the skill set he has.
So don't sweat it. The short answer there, that you're gonna, and I mean, I'll like get, I don't know if you guys do this, but I'll get like halfway through a book that I think I'm doing something really do it different, and then it's like, and I'm like, oh, Jimmy, you're gonna have this same thing.
I recognize this. I had no idea I was doing this.
One theme I find myself revisiting is that and like Stephanie said, I oftentimes don't see it till after I've written my first draft or something, but it's come out like in a necromancer way, in a robot way, like in a falling asleep way. So you just find different ways to approach it, and it is a completely different story, but it's still bringing out those things that are really important to you that you want to explore.
Right. Steve
Debbie mentioned I write about power, which I do. I also write about class and money. Okay, because they're interrelated, but the main thing about power, class, and money is that they reflect on character. All right? Power, class, and money tells you who you are, where you are in any of those hierarchies, and that will help illuminate what your problems are. You know, there are certain problems that people with wealth and power don't have that the rest of us do. I was just reading the other day about he was a member of the Vanderbilt family. This is the 1920s. You know, it's a very rich and prominent family. And he had a fast car, and he loved his fast car. And he would just run people over and kill them. And the police always said it's the fault of the pedestrian. Because it can't be the fault of a Vanderbilt. Okay, if we ran over somebody, that would be a problem for us. In addition to the victim.
You think you would dress up the car?
Yeah.
That's how fast you're going.
Yeah. You know, he deliberately ran over a 7-year-old boy and killed him. And no consequences at all.
Steve Rasnick-Tim, who's a wonderful horror writer, he said that if your father dies and you are struggling to cope with the death of your father, do not write about the death of your father. Write about a robot. Write about a spaceship far from home. Write about something set in ancient Egypt. It will all be about your father, but it will all be about your father in a deeper and more interesting way than if you tried directly to write a story about the death of your father. And I've always found that really good advice.
And I've always found it fascinating that Anne McCaffrey's story, The Ship was Sang, was written about the death of her father.
Right.
And once you know that,
Right.
you can see it in the story, but that's not what the story is about at all.
Right.
I was just, to go back to what Walters and a couple of you have talked about, there's a book called Caste, C-A-S-T-E.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about there.
Yeah, I read it. You read it.
We have about 5 minutes left. Anyone would like to ask the last question? It's your opportunity.
We answered everything.
What do you want to see more of in sci-fi?
Which way was more?
More of in sci-fi. Like, what do you think is underused or could be used more?
I want to see more stuff that breaks my head that I never would have seen coming.
Yeah, that's it.
I want to see more clones. I think people have just kind of touched the edges of how clones could affect everything, because they're so closely bound up to the idea of identity and who we are and who we really are, and how jealous we would be if we thought we had to share our identity with someone else marginally. And also, they've never done, most of the clone stories have been very serious and dark. And we need the clone romance. We need the clone romantic comedy. We need the clone fantasy ghost thing. We need the military set in World War II. We need clones in all this, just because there are so many interesting things to do. They are a ready-made trope because they go straight to the heart of identity and who we are and who we think we are.
Well, listen, Clone Comes Home, your short story, you need to read that short story. It's hilarious.
That I do not have a story about that.
About a guy who thinks who gets scammed about.
Oh, yes.
cloning.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That's a very old story. It's hilarious. It's really old. I wrote it back in my so funny. I love that. I did not have a story about that. I am old also, as you can tell.
Someday I'll forget my work.
You know, it's funny that you say that about clones, because I had a conversation with a guy that I was in a crit group with, and we were talking about clones, as one does. And I said something about, like, are there different spirits that go into the duplicated bodies, and are they, how much does that, inhabiting spirit change?
The soul.
Yeah, and he said, oh, no, it's already been determined that they are exactly the same individual. That's been proven. Yeah. And I was like, it hasn't, and it was like, that was the end of the conversation. Yeah, no, that's been decided. Like,
I don't think so.
I missed the memo on that one.
Well, we do have clones in our society. They're naturally occurring clones are both identical twins.
Right.
Or triplets, right?
So, and each with half a soul, or if they're.
I mean, obviously.
Clearly, we've not subjected them to rigorous enough testing. There is a story for you.
Which clone got the soul? Linked to a lot of sibling rivalry.
Yeah. Great. That sounds like you guys are twisted.
I didn't know this.
We're gonna wrap up there for today. So let's give a round of applause.
So we have two panels here at 4 o'clock. In this room, we will have history and / of science fiction, thinking about how history is incorporated in science fiction and also the history of the genre itself. And next door, we will have Craft of the Story / story crafting, and we will have Mike Rizza moderating that one. Please join one of those. There's some refreshments out there. If you don't know where they are, you're looking for the bathrooms are right there. So, yeah, sure.